The Vistula is swift and very wide, and it was expected that the emperor would limit his winter operations there and cover himself with this river to establish his army in cantonments until the spring. It was otherwise. The corps of Marshals Davout and Lannes, as well as the Guard, crossed the Vistula at Warsaw. Augereau and his troops crossed it at Utrata and headed for Płonsk, from where we then reached the banks of the Ukra, one of the tributaries of the Bug and the Vistula. The entire French army, having crossed this latter river, now found itself facing the Russians, against whom the emperor ordered an attack for the 24th of December. The thaw and the rain made movement infinitely difficult over a clayey ground, for there was not a single paved road in this country. I will refrain from relating the various engagements fought that day by several corps of the French army to force the passage of the Bug. I will confine myself to saying that Marshal Augereau, charged with securing that of the Ukra, had Colozomb attacked by General Desjardins' division and Sochochin by General Hudelay's division at the same time. The Marshal personally directed the attack on Colozomb. The Russians, after burning the bridge that existed at this place, had raised a redoubt on the left bank, which they defended with cannon and numerous infantry, but they forgot to destroy a store of beams and planks placed on the right bank by which we arrived. Our sappers made skillful use of these materials to establish a temporary bridge, despite the liveliness of the enemy's fire, which cost us several men of the 24th of the line, marching at the head of our columns. The planks of the new bridge were not yet fixed, and wobbled under the feet of our infantry, when the colonel of the 24th of the line, Monsieur Savary, brother of the emperor's aide-de-camp, had the temerity to ride across it on horseback, in order to go and place himself at the head of the skirmishers, but he had scarcely debouched on the opposite bank when a Cossack, spurring at the gallop, plunged his lance into his heart and fled into the woods. It was the 5th colonel of the 24th of the line killed before the enemy. You will see later what fatal destiny always accompanied that unfortunate regiment. The passage of the Ukra was carried, the guns were taken, the Russians put to flight, and Desjardins' division established itself at Sochochin, where the enemy had repulsed the attack of Hudelay's division, but, as a single crossing sufficed, the attack was absolutely useless. Nevertheless, General Hudelay, out of a misguided sense of pride, ordered it to be renewed. He was driven back again, and had some 30 men killed or wounded, among them a captain of engineers, an officer of very great promise. I have always revolted against that contempt for the lives of men, which sometimes leads generals to sacrifice them to the desire to see their names in the bulletins. On the 25th of December, the day after the passage of the Ukra, the emperor, driving the Russians before him, moved toward Gowimin, having with him his guard, Murat's cavalry, and the corps of Davout and Augereau. The latter formed the head of column. Marshal Lannes took the direction of Putusk. There were that day a few insignificant encounters, the enemy retreating in all haste. We slept at the bivouac in the woods. On the 26th, the 7th Corps resumed the pursuit of the Russians. We were at the time of year when the days are shortest, and in this part of Poland, at the end of December, night begins around 2:30 in the afternoon. It was all the darker, as we approached Gowimin, because snow mixed with rain was falling. We had not seen any enemy since morning, when, arriving before the village of Ruskovo, at the gates of Gowimin, our scouts, perceiving in the darkness a large mass of troops, which a marsh prevented them from approaching, came to warn Marshal Augereau, who ordered Colonel Albert to reconnoitre this force at the head of 25 chasseurs à cheval of his escort, whom he placed under my command. The mission was difficult, for we were in an immense, flat plain where one could easily lose one's way. The ground, already very muddy, was cut with marshes that the darkness prevented us from distinguishing. We advanced, therefore, with caution, and at last found ourselves 25 paces from a line of troops. We first believed that it was Davout's corps, which we knew to be in the neighborhood. But as no one answered our "Who goes there?" we no longer doubted that they were enemies. However, to gain more complete certainty, Colonel Albert ordered me to send one of the best mounted troopers right up to the line that we could make out in the gloom. I designated for this a decorated brigadier named Schmidt, a man of proven courage. This brave fellow, advancing alone to within 10 paces of a regiment whose helmets made him recognize it as Russian, fired a carbine shot into the midst of a squadron and smartly returned. To explain the silence that the enemy had kept until then, it must be understood that the Russian corps placed before us, being separated from the main body of its army, which it was trying to rejoin, had lost its way in those vast plains, which it knew to be occupied by French troops moving on Govimin. The Russian generals, hoping to pass near us under cover of the darkness, without being recognized, had forbidden any talking, and, in the event of an attack on our part, the wounded were to drop without uttering a single complaint. This order, which only Russian troops can execute, was obeyed so punctiliously that Colonel Albert, wishing to warn Marshal Augereau that we were facing the enemy, ordered the 25 chasseurs to fire a volley by platoon, and not a cry, not a word was heard, and no one replied. We perceived only, despite the darkness, about 100 horsemen advancing silently to cut off our retreat. We then wished to take the gallop to rejoin our columns, but several of our chasseurs got bogged down in the marshes, and we were forced to go more slowly, though we were closely pressed by the Russian horse, who, fortunately, encountered as many difficulties as we did in their advance. A fire suddenly breaking out in a nearby farm, and the plain being illuminated, the Russian cavalry took to the gallop, which forced us to do likewise. The danger became imminent because, having left the French lines through General Desjardins' division, we were re-entering them in front of General Houdelet's division, which, not having seen us depart, began firing toward the enemy, so that we had behind us a Russian squadron pressing us hard, while in front there came a hail of bullets, which wounded several of our chasseurs and some horses. We shouted in vain, "We are French, do not fire!" The fire continued, and one could not blame the officers who took us for the vanguard of a Russian column, whose commanders, to deceive them, used the French language, so widespread among foreigners, in order to surprise, by this stratagem, our regiments during the night, as had already happened. Colonel Albert, I, and my platoon of chasseurs passed a very bad quarter of an hour there. At last, it occurred to me that the only way to make ourselves recognized was to call out by their names the generals, colonels, and battalion commanders of Houdelet's division, names which they knew full well could not be known to the enemy. This succeeded, and we were finally received into the French line. The Russian generals, finding themselves discovered, and wishing to continue their retreat, took a decision that I highly approve, and which, in a similar situation, the French have never been able to bring themselves to imitate. The Russians trained all their artillery in the direction of the French troops. Then, taking away their teams, they opened one of the most violent fires to keep us at a distance. Meanwhile, they moved off their columns, and when their ammunition was exhausted, the gunners withdrew, abandoning the pieces to us. Was this not better than losing many men in trying to save that artillery, which would have bogged down at every instant, and would have delayed the retreat? This violent cannonade by the Russians did us all the more harm in that several fires, having spread in the villages of the plain, cast a glow far off, enabling the enemy gunners to distinguish our massed troops, especially the cuirassiers and dragoons whom Prince Murat had just brought up, and who, wearing white cloaks, served as targets for the Russian artillerymen. These cavalry suffered, therefore, more losses than the other corps, and one of our generals of dragoons, named Fénérol, was cut in two by a cannonball. Marshal Augereau, after having taken Kuskovo, entered Govimin, which Marshal Davout was attacking from another side. This town was being traversed, at that very moment, by the Russian columns, who, knowing that Marshal Lannes was marching to cut off their retreat by seizing Putusk, situated 3 leagues away, were trying to gain that point promptly before him, no matter the cost. Thus, although our soldiers fired on the enemy at 25 paces, They continued on their way without replying, because to do so they would have had to stop, and the moments were too precious. Each division, each regiment, therefore, filed past under our musketry without saying a word, or slowing its march for a single instant. The streets of Goimin were filled with dying and wounded, and not a single groan was heard, for they were forbidden. One would have said we were firing on shadows. At last, our soldiers rushed with the bayonet upon those masses, and only by pricking them did they acquire the conviction that they were dealing with men. About 1,000 prisoners were taken, the rest moved off. The marshals then deliberated whether to pursue the enemy, but the weather was so horrible, the night so black, as soon as one left the vicinity of the fires, the troops were so drenched and worn out that it was decided they would rest until daylight. Goimen being encumbered with dead, wounded, and baggage, Marshals Murat and Augereau, accompanied by several generals and by their numerous staff, seeking shelter from the icy rain, established themselves in an immense stable near the town. There, each man, stretching out on the manure, tried to warm himself and sleep, for it had been more than 20 hours that we were in the saddle in dreadful weather. The marshals, the colonels, all the bigwigs, naturally, settled toward the back of the stable in order to be less cold. I, a poor lieutenant, having entered last, was reduced to lying down near the door, with at most my body out of the rain, but exposed to a glacial wind, for the door no longer had its leaves. The situation was very disagreeable. Add to this that I was dying of hunger, not having eaten since the day before, but my good star again came to my aid. While the great men, well sheltered, slept in the warm part of the stable, and the cold kept the lieutenants placed at the door from doing the same, a servant of Prince Murat presented himself to enter. I pointed out to him in a low voice that his master was asleep, whereupon he handed me, for the prince, a basket containing a roast goose, bread, and wine, asking me to notify his master that the mules carrying the provisions would arrive in an hour. Having said that, he went off to meet them. Provided with these supplies, I held a quiet council with Bro, Manviel, and Stock, who, placed as badly as I was, were shivering and no less famished. The result of this deliberation was that, the prince being asleep, and his canteens due to arrive shortly, he would find breakfast on waking, whereas we would be sent off on horseback in all directions, without anyone inquiring whether we had anything to eat. Consequently, we could, without overburdening our consciences, devour what the basket contained. So it was done in an instant. I do not know whether one can excuse this page's prank, but what is certain is that I have made few meals as pleasant. While the troops that had just fought at Goimin were making this halt, Napoleon and all his guard were wandering in the plain, for, at the very beginning of the action, the emperor, warned by the cannonade, having hastily left the chateau where he was quartered, 2 leagues from Goimin, hoped to join us by steering as the crow flies toward the fire, but the ground was so waterlogged, the plain so cut with marshes, and the weather so dreadful, that he spent the whole night making those 2 leagues, and did not reach the battlefield until long after the affair was over. On the very day of the Battle of Goimin, Marshal Lannes, having with him only 20,000 men, fought at Putusk 42,000 Russians, who were retreating before the other French corps, and inflicted immense losses on them, but could not prevent them from passing. So superior were the enemy forces to those that Lannes could oppose. For the emperor to be in a position to pursue the Russians, the frost would have had to harden the ground, which, on the contrary, was so soft and diluted that one sank at every step, and several men were seen, notably the servant of an officer of the 7th Corps, to drown, themselves and their horses, in the mud. It was therefore becoming impossible to move the artillery or to engage farther in that unknown country. Moreover, the troops lacked provisions as well as shoes, and their fatigue was extreme. These considerations decided Napoleon to grant them a few days of rest by cantoning the whole army beyond the Vistula, from the environs of Warsaw to the gates of Danzig. The soldiers, lodged in the villages, were at last sheltered from the bad weather, received their rations, and were able to mend their kit. The emperor returned to Warsaw to prepare a new campaign. The divisions of Augereau's corps were distributed among the villages around Płonsk, if one can give that name to a confused heap of filthy hovels inhabited by dirty Jews, but almost all the so-called towns of Poland are thus built and peopled, the lords, great and small, constantly remaining in the countryside, where they farm their lands by employing their peasants. The marshal took lodgings at Krystkowo, a kind of manor built of wood according to the custom of the country. He found in that house a passable apartment. The aides-de-camp settled as best they could in the rooms and in the barns. As for me, by dint of ferreting about, I discovered at the gardener's a rather good room furnished with a fireplace. I established myself there with 2 comrades, and, leaving to the gardener and his family their very uninviting beds, we made some for ourselves with planks and straw, on which we did very well. We celebrated, at Kryska, the 1st of January in the year 1807, which very nearly became the last of my life. Yet it began most pleasantly for me, because the emperor, who had granted no favors to Augereau's staff during the Austerlitz campaign, amply repaired that omission by showering it with rewards. Colonel Albert was made a brigadier general, Commandant Massy became lieutenant colonel of the 44th of the line, several aides-de-camp were decorated, and finally, Lieutenants Bro, Manviel, and I were promoted to captain. This promotion pleased me all the more because I did not expect it, having done nothing remarkable to earn it, and I was only 24 years old. Handing Manviel, Bro, and me our captain's commissions, Marshal Augereau said, "We shall see which of you 3 becomes a colonel first." It was I, for 6 years later I commanded a regiment, while my 2 comrades were still simple captains. It is true that, in that span, I had received 6 wounds, our cantonments established, the enemy took theirs opposite, though at a fair distance from ours. The emperor expected they would let us pass the winter quietly, but it turned out otherwise. Our rest lasted only a month, which was a great deal, without being enough. The Russians, seeing the ground covered with snow hardened by very severe frosts, thought that this rigor of the season would give the men of the north an immense advantage over the men of the south, little accustomed to endure great cold. They resolved, in consequence, to attack us, and to carry out this plan they moved, beginning on the 25th of January, most of their troops posted opposite ours in front of Warsaw, behind the immense forests that separated us from them, and directed them toward the lower Vistula against the cantonments of Bernadotte and Ney, whom they hoped to surprise and overwhelm with their masses, before the emperor and the other corps of his army could come to these 2 marshals' aid. But Bernadotte and Ney resisted valiantly, and Napoleon, warned in time, marched with considerable forces against the enemy's rear, who, threatened with being cut off from their base of operations, began a retreat toward Königsberg. We therefore had to leave, on the 1st of February, the cantonments where we were fairly well established, begin the war anew, and go sleep on the snow. At the head of the central column, commanded by the emperor in person, was Prince Murat's cavalry, then Marshal Soult's corps, supported by Augereau's, and finally came the Imperial Guard. Davout's corps marched on the right flank of this immense column, and Marshal Ney's on its left. Such an agglomeration of troops, moving toward the same point, soon exhausted the supplies the country could furnish, and we suffered greatly from hunger. The Guard alone, having wagons, carried with it enough to meet distributions. The other corps lived as they could, which is to say, they lacked almost everything. I am all the more inclined to give few details on the actions that preceded the Battle of Eylau, because Marshal Augereau's troops, marching in the second line, took no part in those various combats, the most important of which took place at Morungen, Bergfried, Gutstadt, and Waltersdorf. At last, on the 6th of February, the Russians, pursued with the sword at their backs for 8 days, resolved to stop and stand firm in front of the small town of Landsberg. To that end, They placed 8 elite battalions in the excellent position of Hof, their right resting on the village of that name, their left on a thick wood, their center covered by a very deep ravine, which could be crossed only by a very narrow bridge. 8 guns lined the front of this position. The emperor, arriving opposite this position with Murat's cavalry, did not think it proper to wait for Marshal Soult's infantry, which was still several leagues behind, and ordered the Russians to be attacked by a few regiments of light cavalry, which, darting bravely onto the bridge, crossed the ravine. But, overwhelmed by musketry and grape shot, our squadrons were thrown back in disorder into the ravine, from which they emerged with great difficulty. The emperor, seeing the efforts of the light cavalry useless, replaced them with a division of dragoons, whose attack, received in the same fashion, had equally poor results. Napoleon then brought forward General d'Hautpoul's terrible cuirassiers, who, crossing the bridge and the ravine under a hail of canister, fell with such speed upon the Russian line that they literally laid it flat. There was, at that moment, a frightful slaughter. The cuirassiers, enraged by the losses their comrades, hussars and dragoons, had just suffered, almost entirely exterminated the 8 Russian battalions. Everything was killed or captured. The battlefield inspired horror. Never was a cavalry charge seen to have such complete results. The emperor, to show his satisfaction to the cuirassiers, embraced their general in the presence of the whole division, whereupon d'Hautpoul exclaimed, "To prove myself worthy of such an honor, I must get myself killed for your majesty." He kept his word, for the next day he died on the battlefield of Eylau. What an era, and what men! The enemy army, which, from the heights beyond Landsberg, witnessed the destruction of its rearguard, promptly fell back on Eylau, and we took possession of the town of Landsberg. On the 7th of February, the Russian commander-in-chief, Bennigsen, being quite resolved to accept battle, concentrated his army around Eylau, and chiefly on the positions behind that town. Murat's cavalry and Marshal Soult's infantry seized that position after one of the fiercest combats, for the Russians set great store by keeping Ziegelhof, which dominates Eylau, counting on making it the center of their line for the next day's battle, but they were forced to retire from the town. Night seemed likely to put an end to the fighting, a prelude to a general action, when a sharp fusillade burst out in the streets of Eylau. I know that military writers who have described this campaign claim the emperor, not wishing to leave this town in Russian hands, ordered it attacked, but I am certain this is a very great error, and here is the basis of my assertion. At the moment when the head of Marshal Augereau's column, arriving by the road from Landsberg, was nearing Ziegelhof, the marshal climbed that plateau, where the emperor already was, and I heard Napoleon say to Augereau, "They propose to me to take Eylau this evening, but, besides that, I do not like night fighting. I do not want to thrust my center too far forward before the arrival of Davout, who is my right wing, and of Ney, who is my left wing. I am therefore going to wait for them until tomorrow on this plateau, which, lined with artillery, offers our infantry an excellent position, and then, when Ney and Davout are in line, we shall all march together on the enemy." So saying, Napoleon ordered his bivouac established at the foot of Ziegelhof and his guard to encamp all around. But while the emperor was thus explaining his plans to Marshal Augereau, who greatly praised his prudence, here is what was happening. The orderlies of the imperial household, coming from Landsberg, followed by their baggage and servants, reached our outposts at the entrance to Eylau, without anyone having told them to stop near Ziegelhof. These employees, accustomed to seeing the imperial quarters always very well guarded, and not having been warned that they were a few steps from the Russians, thought only of choosing good lodging for their master, and set themselves up in the post-house, where they unpacked their equipment, began cooking, and stabled their horses. But, attacked in the midst of their preparations by an enemy patrol, they would have been carried off, had it not been for the detachment of the guard that constantly accompanied the emperor's train. At the noise of the fusillade that broke out at this point, Marshal Soult's troops, posted at the town gates, ran to the aid of Napoleon's baggage, which the Russian troops were already plundering. The enemy generals, believing the French wished to seize Eylau, sent reinforcements of their own, so that a bloody fight was engaged in the streets of the town, which ended by remaining in our hands. Although this attack had not been ordered by the emperor, he nevertheless thought it best to profit from it, and established himself at the post-house of Eylau. His guard and Soult's corps occupied the town, which Murat's cavalry encircled. Augereau's troops were placed at Zayenne, a little hamlet in which we hoped to find some resources, but the Russians had pillaged everything as they fell back, so that our unfortunate regiments, which had received no rations for 8 days, had only a few potatoes and water to restore them. The 7th Corps staff's baggage having been left at Landsberg, our supper was not even as good as the soldiers', for we could not procure potatoes. At last, on the morning of the 8th, at the moment when we were about to mount to march against the enemy, a servant having brought a loaf to the marshal, he, ever full of kindness, shared it among all his aides-de-camp, and, after that frugal meal, which was to be the last for several of us, the corps took the post the emperor had assigned to it. In accordance with the plan I have set for myself in writing these memoirs, I will not tire your attention with too detailed an account of the various phases of that terrible battle of Eylau, and will confine myself to the principal facts. On the 8th of February, in the morning, the position of the two armies was this. The Russians had their left at Serpalen, their center in front of Auklapen, their right at Schmoditen, and they awaited 8,000 Prussians who were to debouch by Althoff and form their extreme right. The front of the enemy line was covered by 500 pieces of artillery, at least a third of them of large caliber. The French situation was far less favorable, since, our two wings not having yet arrived, the emperor had, at the beginning of the action, only a part of the troops on which he had counted to give battle. Marshal Soult's corps was placed to the right and left of Eylau, the guard in that town, Augereau's corps between Rothenen and Eylau, facing Serpalen. You see that the enemy formed a half-circle around us, and that the two armies occupied ground on which there were numerous ponds, but the snow covered them. Neither side perceived this, nor did either fire ricochet shot to break the ice, which would have brought about a catastrophe like the one that occurred on Lake Satchan at the end of the Battle of Austerlitz. Marshal Davout, whom we awaited on our right, toward Mollwitten, and Marshal Ney, who was to form our left, toward Althoff, had not yet appeared when, at daybreak, about 8 o'clock, the Russians began the attack with one of the most violent cannonades, to which our artillery, though less numerous, replied with all the more advantage, because our gunners, far better trained than the enemy's, were aiming at masses of men with no cover, while most of the Russian balls struck the walls of Rothenen and Eylau. A strong enemy column soon advanced to seize the latter town. It was sharply repulsed by the Guard and by Marshal Soult's troops. The emperor learned at that moment, with joy, that from the top of the church tower one could see Davout's corps arriving by Mollwitten and marching on Serpalen, from which he drove the Russian left, pushing it back as far as Klein-Sausgarten. Marshal Bennigsen, seeing his left beaten and his rear threatened by the audacious Davout, resolved to crush him by throwing a great part of his troops against him. Then it was that Napoleon, wishing to prevent that movement by making a diversion on the enemy center, ordered Marshal Augereau to attack it, though he foresaw the difficulty of this operation. But, on battlefields, there are circumstances in which one must know how to sacrifice a few troops to save the greater number and secure victory. General Corbineau, the Emperor's aide-de-camp, was killed beside us by a cannon shot, at the very moment he was carrying to Marshal Augereau the order to advance. The Marshal, passing with his 2 divisions between Eylau and Rothenen, marched proudly against the center of the enemy, and already the 14th of the line, which formed our vanguard, had seized the position the Emperor had ordered to be taken and held at all costs, when the numerous heavy guns that formed a semicircle around Augereau loosed such a hail of round shot and canister that, in living memory, no one had ever seen the like. In an instant, our 2 divisions were shattered beneath that rain of iron. General Desjardins was killed, General Houdelet grievously wounded, yet we stood firm, until the corps being almost completely destroyed, we were forced to bring its remnants back near Eylau's cemetery, save only the 14th of the line, which, totally surrounded by the enemy, remained on the knoll it occupied. Our situation was all the worse, in that a most violent wind blew a thick snow in our faces, preventing us from seeing beyond 15 paces, so that several French batteries fired on us at the same time as those of the enemy. Marshal Augereau was wounded by a chain shot. However, the devotion of the 7th Corps had just produced a good result, for not only had Marshal Davout, relieved by our attack, been able to hold his positions, but he had seized Kleinsausgarten and had even pushed his vanguard as far as Kuschitten on the enemy's rear. Then it was that the Emperor, wishing to strike the great blow, sent between Eylau and Rottenen 90 squadrons commanded by Murat. These terrible masses, falling upon the Russian center, broke it, sabred it, and threw it into the greatest disorder. The valiant General de Hautpoul was killed in the melee at the head of his cuirassiers, as was General Dahlmann, who had succeeded General Morland in command of the Chasseurs of the Guard. The success of our cavalry assured the gain of the battle. In vain did 8,000 Prussians, who had escaped Marshal Ney's pursuit, debouching by Althoff, attempt a new attack by moving, for reasons unknown, on Kuschitten instead of marching on Eylau. Marshal Davout repulsed them, and with the arrival of Ney's corps, which appeared toward nightfall at Schmoditten, making Bennigsen fear to see his communications cut, he ordered a retreat on Königsberg and left the French masters of that horrible field of battle covered with corpses and dying men. Since the invention of gunpowder, no one had seen such terrible effects, for, having regard to the number of troops engaged at Eylau, it is, of all ancient or modern battles, the one in which the losses were relatively the greatest. The Russians had 25,000 men out of action, and although the number of French struck by shot or shell has been put at only 10,000, I estimate it at no less than 20,000. The total for both armies was therefore 45,000 men, more than half of whom died. Augereau's corps was almost entirely destroyed, since, out of 15,000 combatants present under arms at the beginning of the action, there remained that evening only 3,000, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Massy. The Marshal, all the generals, and all the colonels had been wounded or killed. It is hard to understand why Bennigsen, knowing that Davout and Ney were still behind, did not take advantage of their absence to attack, at daybreak, the town of Eylau with the very numerous troops of the center of his army, rather than lose precious time bombarding us, for the superiority of his forces would certainly have made him master of the town before Davout's arrival, and the Emperor would then have regretted having pushed so far forward, instead of fortifying himself on the plateau of Ziegelhof and waiting there for his wings, as he had planned the evening before. The day after the battle, the Emperor pursued the Russians to the gates of Königsberg, but as that town had some fortifications, it was not judged prudent to attack it with troops weakened by bloody combats, all the more since almost the whole Russian army was in or around Königsberg. Napoleon spent several days at Eylau, both to bring in the wounded and to reorganize his armies. Marshal Augereau's corps being almost destroyed, its remnants were distributed among the other corps, and the Marshal received permission to return to France in order to recover from his wound. The Emperor, seeing the bulk of the Russian army withdrawn, quartered his troops in towns, boroughs, and villages in front of the lower Vistula. There was, during the rest of the winter, nothing remarkable except the capture of the fortress of Danzig by the French. Hostilities in the open field did not resume until the month of June, as we shall see later. That concludes the 25th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.